Have you ever felt that inexplicable chill, as if you were being watched, even though you were alone? Imagine being on an isolated farm, surrounded by the silence of the night, but hearing footsteps in the attic, dark laughter in the hallways, and shadows appearing where they shouldn't be. That's exactly what Lucas faced in a terrifying story that will keep you hooked from start to finish. If you like real and scary stories that will stir your imagination and make you question what's around you, stay with me. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and get ready to unravel the darkest mysteries of this cursed farm. Don't miss a single detail. First story, the Farm of Night Whispers. Well, before we continue with the video, just check if you're already subscribed to the channel. Because here, we're going to bring you a series of videos like this one, with incredible, terrifying stories for you. Let's continue. Lucas had been driving along the dirt road for almost an hour. The landscape around him was made up of vast fields, dotted with solitary trees and worn-out fences. Dusk was quickly departing, and the sky was beginning to turn. Dark shades of blue and black. The beam of the headlights revealed only the essentials, the path ahead, full of rocks and holes, and the silhouettes of the trees, which seemed taller and more menacing under the cover of night. Finally, he spotted the farm gate. A rusty arch held a sign that read, "Mirante Farm," letters carved into weathered wood. As he got out of the car to open the gate, Lucas felt the air heavy and cold, a breeze that seemed to carry something more than just wind. He looked around. There was nothing in sight but darkness and the distant sound of crickets. Yet he felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if someone or something were watching him. As he pulled up in front of the main house, Lucas couldn't help but notice how abandoned the property seemed, despite the fact that it was technically inhabited. The windows of the wooden house were covered by thick, faded curtains. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the boards creaked beneath his feet as he climbed the 3 steps to the porch. He couldn't help but feel that something about the house wasn't right. When he opened the door, the interior was completely silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wood. He turned on the main light, but the dim, yellowish glow did nothing to dispel the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. Everything looked old, as if time had stood still here. Heavy wooden furniture, a sofa covered in dingy fabric, and a fireplace that looked as if it hadn't been used in decades made up the scene. As he walked down the hallway, something caught his eye. A large, ornately framed mirror hanging on the wall. He couldn't explain why, but the mirror made him uneasy. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he passed it, as if his reflection were watching him differently. At the back of the house, he found the room that would be his. It was simple, with a wrought iron bed and a small lamp on the bedside table. Lucas tried to convince himself that this place was just an old house, nothing more, but there was something about the details that bothered him. The slightly damp smell, the scratch marks on the wooden floor, and that persistent feeling of being watched. That night, as he was unpacking his things, Lucas heard something. First, it was a soft creaking sound coming from the attic. He ignored it, blaming it on the old structure of the house. But then came a different sound, something more dragging, almost like footsteps. He froze for a moment, his ears straining. Nothing else happened, and he laughed nervously at himself, blaming it on fatigue and his imagination. But as he lay down to sleep, the silence was broken again. This time, it was the sound of something lightly tapping against one of the windows. Lucas felt his heart race. He got up slowly and went to the window, pulling the curtains back with a quick movement. Outside, only the pitch black of the night and the outlines of trees swaying in the wind. He closed the curtains tightly and tried to ignore the growing, feeling that something very wrong awaited him on that farm. Night fell heavily over the farm, Lucas, despite his discomfort, tried to convince himself that the sounds and sensations were just the fruit of his tired mind. He lay down on the narrow bed, but sleep seemed miles away. The silence in the house was almost absolute, broken only by the distant buzzing of insects outside. That was when he heard it again. First, a soft creaking sound, as if someone were stepping downstairs. The sound was so subtle that Lucas tried to ignore it until something fell with a crash. He jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. With shaking hands, he grabbed the flashlight he had brought for emergencies. Despite the dim light from the lamp beside the bed, the hallway felt like a storm drain. The wood of the floor creaked beneath his feet as he approached the stairs. Bad lights. Old house. Nothing special, he muttered to himself, trying to calm himself. But when he reached the top of the stairs, Lucas stopped. The sound of footsteps echoed from below, now clearly audible. Slowly, he descended the steps, each one emitting an ominous groan. When he reached the ground floor, the living room looked different. The shadows seemed thicker, as if they had taken on a life of their own. He shone the flashlight into the dark corners, but all he found was the old sofa and the abandoned furniture. Then something caught his attention. The back door, which he was sure was locked, was now ajar. A shiver ran down his spine. He walked to the door and carefully closed it, turning the key in the lock. But before he could turn around, a noise behind. It made him freeze. It was a low sound, a murmur that seemed to come from the opposite corner of the room. Lucas quickly turned the flashlight in that direction. The flickering light revealed a rocking chair, which now moved on its own, creaking, slowly, as if someone invisible were sitting there. He tried to rationalize it, blaming it on the wind that had blown in through the open door, but the air around him was still, stifling even. Suddenly, a sound coming from upstairs drew his attention back. It was a distinct noise, like something heavy being dragged. He pointed the flashlight at the stairs, but hesitated to go up. Whatever was happening seemed to want to draw his attention to that specific part of the house. Finally, gathering his courage, Lucas climbed the stairs again. When he reached the hallway, the attic door was slightly ajar, something he hadn't noticed before. He was sure it had been locked when he first arrived at the farmhouse. As he climbed the short flight of stairs that led to the attic, the air seemed colder, and the smell of mold and old wood grew stronger. With each step, the silence became deafening. When he finally pushed open the attic door, the beam of his flashlight revealed a space crammed with old objects, trunks, furniture covered with dusty sheets, and scattered boxes. But in the center of the attic, something stood out. A chair was positioned in the light from a round window. Over it, a piece of dark fabric hung, almost like a cloak. And beside it on the floor, there were marks, as if something had been dragged there recently. Lucas felt that this was not normal. He turned on his heel to head downstairs, but was stopped by a low, drawn-out sound, like a sigh, coming from the darkest corner of the attic. He quickly shone his light on the room, but the light from his flashlight seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. Whatever was up there, Lucas was sure of one thing: he was not alone. So have you ever heard of farm horror stories? Leave a comment with what you know about it, and if you believe in these stories. Continuing, Lucas felt his heart pounding in his chest as the flashlight trembled in his hand. The sigh he had heard echoed in his mind, more menacing every second. He knew he should get out of there, but something, a macabre curiosity, urged him to continue. It was as if the entire attic was calling to him, demanding that he discover the secret hidden in that darkness. Advancing with slow steps, he illuminated the floor around him. The marks on the floor were not just scratches, they were trails of something heavy that had been moved recently. The trail ended at a large wooden chest with rusty hardware and an appearance so old that it seemed to belong to another century. He swallowed hard, feeling the heavy air making it hard to breathe. With a trembling hand, he opened the trunk lid. The creaking was deafening in the silence of the attic. Inside, there was something that made his blood run cold. Old photographs of families, all taken right there on the farm with smiling faces. Except for one thing. In each photo in the background, a shadowy figure appeared, always out of focus, always close, but never identifiable. Among the photos, Lucas found a diary, the pages yellowed with age. He began to leaf through it, and each word seemed to tell a horror story. Disappearances, unexplained accidents, and reports of a presence inhabiting the house. The last entry was dated decades ago, but the final message seemed like a direct warning. If you found this diary, it's already too late. She knows you're here. Suddenly, a sound pulled him from his thoughts. It was the creaking of the rocking chair in the attic, but this time he knew he wasn't alone. Turning slowly, he shone his light in the direction of the sound. In the chair, a pale, almost translucent figure swayed gently, with empty eyes that seemed to bore straight through him. Lucas doesn't remember how he managed to get out of the attic. He ran through the house, through hallways that seemed longer and darker than before, until he reached the outside. As he caught his breath in the cold night, the farm remained silent, as if nothing had happened. But as he walked away, he looked back one last time. In the attic window, that same figure watched, motionless, as if to say, "I will always be here." Memorable conclusion. And so Lucas escaped with his life, but he was never able to erase the images of what he saw on that farm. Does the presence he encountered remain there, waiting for new, unsuspecting visitors? Or has it followed him, lurking in some dark corner of his house? Stories like this make us think, how far can curiosity take us? If you were intrigued by this story, just imagine what else we have in store to tell. Don't forget to like this video, share it with anyone who loves a good mystery, and subscribe to the channel. We're just beginning our journey through the most chilling and unbelievable stories. Turn on the bell, because the next story could be even scarier than this one. And remember, be careful when exploring unknown places, because you never know what you might find. Until next time, if you dare. Second story. The night of the screams at the abandoned farm. Have you ever felt like you were being watched in a place where everything should be empty? Imagine an isolated farm, where the silence of the night is broken by whispers that shouldn't be there. Today, you'll learn about real and scary stories that happened on farms, places that should be havens of peace, but have become the stage for dark and inexplicable mysteries. Get ready to feel your heart race and the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. And if you want to discover the truth behind these stories, stay with me until the end, because this is just the beginning. Like, subscribe and come and uncover these terrifying secrets. It was a late afternoon, like any other on Donna Estella's farm. The sky displayed shades of orange and red, while the sun hid on the horizon, plunging the vast cornfields into a golden twilight. The leaves of the plants swayed gently in the breeze, producing that characteristic sound that always brought peace to those who lived there. But that day, there was something different, something that no one could explain. The field workers were starting to gather their tools and talk about dinner when one of them, young Matthias, suddenly stopped. His gaze was fixed on the direction of the farthest row of corn. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The others looked at each other, confused. "What was that?" answered Tiao, the oldest among them, already tired of Matthias and his stories. But the boy did not take his eyes off the field, pointing with a trembling finger. There was someone walking around there, a man, but he was strange, very tall, and he didn't seem to touch the ground. The nervous laughter of the others was drowned out by the silence that followed. No one could ignore the strange atmosphere that hung over the countryside. Estela, who was watching the scene from the porch of the main house, frowned. There was something in Matthias's gaze that made her take what he was saying seriously. "Let's take a closer look at this. Maybe it's a thief or someone lost," she said, picking up a flashlight. With a group of 3 men, including Matthias and Tiao, they entered the cornfield. Each step seemed heavier, and the silence around them was disturbing. There were no sounds of insects, birds, or even the wind that had previously moved the leaves. As they advanced, the group felt a strange presence, as if they were being watched by invisible eyes. Estela's flashlight began to flicker, increasing the tension. "This always works perfectly," she muttered, tapping the device with her hand. Suddenly, Matthias froze. "There he is!" he shouted, pointing again. Everyone looked in the direction he indicated, and for a brief moment, they saw him. A tall, thin figure with long arms and movements that seemed to float. His face, if he had one, was obscured by shadow, but there was something about him that gave instant chills. Before anyone could react, the figure vanished like smoke into thin air. The men froze, except for Matthias, who began to back away, his eyes wide. "That's not human," he whispered. Estela, trying to remain calm, took a step forward. "Whoever it is, we're not afraid of you," she shouted, her voice echoing across the field. But there was no answer, only the crushing silence that now felt heavier than ever. As they returned home, each swore they would never speak of what had happened. But in truth, no one could forget. Mainly because, when they reached the balcony, Estela found something that chilled her blood. Marks on the ground like human footprints, but much larger, made with something that seemed to be incandescent. The marks glowed faintly before disappearing, as if they had never been there. That night, no one could sleep. Everyone knew that what they had seen was not a figment of their imagination. Something was there, in the fields of the farm. And, by the looks of it, it didn't intend to leave any time soon. The dawn brought an unusual cold, the kind of cold that seems not to come from the weather, but from something that invades the soul. Estela was awake, sitting in her rocking chair near the window. She couldn't stop thinking about the figure they had seen in the field. The feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave her. Outside, the wind made the cornfield whisper, but there was something else. A sound that was not part of nature. It was a light, almost imperceptible scratching coming from the front door. Estela froze. The clock on the wall read 2:13 in the morning. Who or what could be there at this time? Getting up slowly, she picked up the flashlight, which now seemed to be working perfectly, and walked to the door. Her heart was beating so hard that she feared the sound could be heard outside. When she opened the door, Estela was startled and took a step back. There was no one there. But right on the threshold of the entrance was the scarecrow of the field, the one that always stood fixed in the center of the cornfield. He was there, standing crooked, with his head tilted as if he were observing the house. "That's impossible," Estela murmured, trying to understand how the scarecrow could have ended. Up there, her eyes analyzed the details. The worn clothes, the patches on the straw hat, and the face made of old cloth, with crudely drawn eyes that now seemed to be looking directly at her. She took a step back and called Matthias and Tiao, who were sleeping, in a room in the back. The two came running, still trying to wake up completely. "What is it, Mrs. Estela?" Tiao asked, rubbing his eyes. "Look at this." Estela pointed to the threshold. The two men froze when they saw the scarecrow. Matthias was the first to speak. I knew there was something wrong with that thing." Tiao, trying to be rational, took a step forward. "It's just someone playing a prank. Maybe the village kids." He reached out to touch the scarecrow, but the moment his fingers touched the straw, he quickly pulled away. It's hot, like it's been burned." Estela noticed something strange on the ground. Underneath the scarecrow, there were marks similar to the footprints seen in the field, but now they were deeper and seemed to form a pattern, like a circle burned into the wood of the porch. "There's no way this is a prank," she said, trying to remain calm. "Who would move a scarecrow and still leave those marks? And how?" Matthias, trembling, took a step back. "This wasn't done by people. This thing, it came by itself." The silence that followed was overwhelming, interrupted only by the sound of the wind. Tiao picked up a stick and carefully pushed the scarecrow off the porch. "We'll take this back to the field tomorrow morning. I'm not going to lose any sleep over a straw doll." They locked the door and went back inside, but no one could sleep. Estella stayed in the armchair, holding a rosary in her hands. Matthias huddled in the corner of the room, murmuring prayers. Tian, despite trying to maintain his posture, could not close his eyes. When morning finally came, everyone went out to check on the scarecrow, but it was no longer there. Only the burn marks on the ground remained, like a frightening reminder of what had happened the night before. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the farm, one certainty took hold of everyone. That scarecrow was not just a pile of straw and fabric. It was connected to something darker, something that seemed to be getting closer and closer. Night fell like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a suffocating silence. The wind that had once stirred the leaves of the cornfield now seemed to have disappeared, leaving the air still and charged with tension. Estella, Matthias and Tiao were gathered in the kitchen, each lost in their own thoughts. The farm seemed alive in a frightening way, and they all knew that the only thing left to do was to face whatever was lurking. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed from the barn. It was as if something heavy had been dragged or dropped, followed by a strange murmur, almost human but distorted. Estella jumped to her feet, holding an old lamp. "It's time to end this. Either we face it now, or we'll never have peace again." Matthias tried to protest, but Tiao, with his determination renewed, picked up a hoe and nodded. "Whatever it is, we can't run away." The path to the barn seemed longer than ever. With each step, the sound grew clearer, scratching, rustling, and the constant sound of something moving. When they reached it, the large barn door was ajar, revealing a darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. With shaking hands, Estella pushed open the door, and the beam of light from the lamp illuminated the interior. The scene was terrifying. The scarecrow was there in the center of the barn, but it was no longer the same. The straw that made up its body seemed to be moving, as if it were alive, writhing in an unnatural way. Its cloth eyes, now glowing with a reddish light, followed their movements. Matthias took a step back. This is not possible." The scarecrow moved, a slow, almost human movement, and then leaned forward slightly as if observing them curiously. The voice that came next was a mix between a whisper and a distant scream. "You should not be here." Tiao, with his heart in his throat, raised his hoe and advanced, but before he could get close, an invisible force threw him against the wall. He screamed, but the sound was muffled by the distorted laughter that echoed through the barn. Estella, now in pure despair, raised the lantern and shone the light directly on the scarecrow. The light seemed to affect him, for he began to contort violently, his form dissolving into straw and shadows. "Matthias! The fire! Use the fire!" Matthias, overcome by the courage of desperation, grabbed a nearby hanging lantern and threw it hard at the scarecrow. The glass shattered and the flames spread quickly. The scarecrow let out a deafening scream, and the barn was filled with intense light as he burned. The flames went out as quickly as they had started, leaving the barn in absolute silence. In the center, where the scarecrow had been, only a small circle of ash remained, with marks that looked like ancient runes engraved on the ground. They staggered out of the barn, exhausted and scarred by the experience. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first rays of sunlight, and the farm finally seemed at peace. Estella looked at the two men and whispered, "We may never understand what that was, but at least now we can start over." That was the last time anything strange happened on the farm. But to this day, when the wind blows hard at night, Estella still feels like she is being watched, as if the scarecrow had never really left. Memorable conclusion. And so ends another story that defies logic and what we know as reality. Stories like this make us wonder, what else could be hidden in the darkness of the night? And are we really alone? If you enjoyed this narrative full of mystery and tension, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more terrifying and engaging stories like this one. Share it with your friends and come discover other dark secrets that await us in the next story. Will you dare to watch it? Let's move on to the third story. The echo of whispers in the basement. Imagine moving to a secluded farm, seeking peace and a new beginning, only to discover that the place's past was never really buried, and that it is still there, waiting. Have you ever heard unexplained whispers in the silence of the night? Have you ever felt that chill of being watched, even though you are alone? Today, you will learn the story of a family who opened a door that had been locked for decades and released something that should never have been awakened. Hold on tight, because what you are about to hear will change the way you view silence. If you are a fan of mysteries and chilling stories, this video is for you. Before the secrets of this farm are revealed, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories like this one. And if you're already curious, leave a like right now. Let's go. It was a night no one would forget. The sky, previously serene, had been swallowed by black clouds that appeared out of nowhere, as if summoned by something beyond human comprehension. Lightning streaked the horizon, illuminating the desolate landscape of the farm for a brief second. The storm seemed like a wild beast, roaring and threatening with its overwhelming force. In the midst of this chaos, young Clara, newly arrived at her family's farm, looked out the window of the old house and felt something strange in the air. A sensation that went beyond the fear of a simple storm. Clara had never felt so isolated. The farm was miles from any town, surrounded only by vast fields and trees that seemed to dance eerily in the wind. It was as if nature itself was trying to warn her of something. The sound of thunder was not only loud, it seemed to echo off the walls, reverberating in her bones. And then came the sound that truly froze her in place, a call, low and almost swallowed by the roar of the storm, but unmistakable. Clara. She turned away from the window, her heart beating so fast it felt like it wanted to burst from her chest. Who could be out there in the middle of this storm? The sound seemed to be coming from the barn, a building that no one had used or even mentioned since the family had moved to the property. Clara remembered her father's words, spoken in a stern tone. Never go into the barn at night, no matter what you hear. But that call, it couldn't be ignored. It seemed to carry something more than words, an urgency, an ache, something that seemed direct to her. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind playing with her mind, but the sound came again, clearer this time, almost as if it were right next to her ear. "Clara, please!" A shiver ran down her spine. Now she knew she wasn't imagining it. Fighting the panic, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen table. The old house felt colder than usual, and the darkness seemed to wrap around her like a cloak. Clara hesitated, thinking about waking her parents, but something about the voice seemed so personal. As she opened the front door, the wind nearly ripped the wood from her hands, bringing with it a cold blast and the unmistakable smell of wet earth. The rain pounded against the earth, as if trying to drown out any trace of the world. Around her, Clara followed the stone path that led to the barn, her feet sinking into the mud and her hair sticking to her face. Each step felt like a challenge, and the call continued, growing louder and more desperate. The barn stood there, large and imposing, like a monster sleeping in the heart of the storm. When she reached the door, she stopped, her hand trembling on the latch. The calling had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed more frightening than any sound. She knew something was waiting on the other side, something that might not be undone, but Clara was not the type to run away. Gathering her courage, she opened the barn door, and what she saw made her heart stop. Inside, the wind seemed to cease, as if the place were sealed off from the outside world. And in the center of the dirt floor was something she never expected to find, something that felt very, very wrong. The air inside the barn was thick, heavy, as if it held an ancient secret that should never be revealed. Clara gripped the flashlight, and tightly, her fingers shaking. The beam of light flickered as she looked around. Weathered wooden walls, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, old rusty tools carelessly thrown about. But what really caught her attention was a wooden door set into the ground, almost completely hidden by bales of straw. She didn't remember seeing that door before, but there it was, with rusty hinges and a metal ring to pull it open. The feeling that something was watching her was almost suffocating. Clara heard the wind howl outside, but inside the barn it was absolute silence, as if the place had been cut off from the world. She hesitated for a moment, questioning her own sanity. "What am I doing?" she thought. But then the memory of the call, that voice so desperate, so human, echoed in her mind. "Clara, please." Determined to find out the truth, she walked slowly to the door. When she touched the ring, a shiver ran down her arm as if the metal itself were alive. Closing her eyes for a moment, she pulled hard. The door creaked in protest, revealing a stone staircase that led down to a dark, dank basement. The smell that came from below was overwhelming, a mixture of wet earth, rotting wood, and something else, something metallic and sickening that she couldn't quite identify. Clara shone her flashlight down the staircase and saw that the walls were made of jagged stone, covered in moss. She swallowed hard and began to descend, each step echoing in the cramped space. As she moved forward, something seemed to change. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and the sound of the wind disappeared completely. Deep in the basement, Clara found a surprisingly large space. There were shelves filled with glass jars, with strange liquids and indistinct shapes floating. Inside them, a chill ran through her. In the center of the basement, a table was covered with old papers and an unlit oil lamp. But what caught her attention most was a tall mirror, framed in twisted iron, that seemed out of place in the room. The glass was slightly fogged, but she could see her reflection, or at least something that should have been her reflection. Clara moved closer to the mirror, unable to look away. But then, something moved. Not in her, but in the reflection. It was as if a shadow were behind her, something that shouldn't be there. Turning quickly, she saw nothing, but the mirror still showed the shadowy figure, now closer, reaching out toward her. Fear gripped Clara, but her legs felt glued to the floor. And then she heard it again. "Clara, come back to us." The voice came from the mirror. The shadow within it now had form, a pale face contorted in agony, its eyes black. As night, the figure seemed trapped, thrashing against the glass as if trying to escape. Clara backed away, but something in the creature's expression, a mix of despair and fury, froze her. It was then that she noticed the words written on the top of the mirror, carved into the rusty iron. "Only blood opens the portal." Her heart raced. What did that mean? And why did that voice seem to know her name? She started to back away, but the basement door creaked and closed by itself, leaving her trapped in the dark. So have you ever heard of farm horror stories? Leave a comment with what you know about it and if you believe in these stories. Continuing. 3. The past that never left. Clara tried to open the basement door with all her strength, but it was as if it were cemented shut. The mirror in front of her seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. The shadow inside it got closer and closer, the murmurs turning into screams that echoed through the space. "You shouldn't have come, but it's too late now," the guttural voice whispered, an echo that seemed to fill every corner of her mind. Clara's flashlight began to flicker, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Her body shook uncontrollably, but her mind refused to give in to panic. That was when she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the mirror's reflection, an old photograph hung in its frame, worn with age. Trembling, she approached the mirror. In the photograph, a family posed in front of the barn. Their faces were all too familiar. Clara saw herself there, a small child holding a woman's hand. Her heart sank. How could she be in that picture? The mirror began to crack, thin lines spreading like spiderwebs across the glass. The shadow whispered one last time, "You've always belonged here." Before Clara could react, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, a wave of dark energy, throwing her backwards. When she opened her eyes, she was lying in the field, the barn in the distance, lit only by the moon. There was no sign of the cellar, the mirror, or even the strange barn where it had all happened. Everything seemed normal, but Clara knew it wasn't. Inside her, something had changed. A feeling that the past she had tried to forget would never leave her alone. Now, she feared what else might be buried in her family's history. But do you want to know the most disturbing thing? That voice still called to her, even from a distance, like a whispered echo in the silent nights. Did you like this story? Did it give you goosebumps and make you want to find out what's behind each mystery? Then be sure to check out more videos like this one. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any dark tales. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, leave a like and share it with your friends who love a good mystery. Comment below, which part of this story made your heart race? We'd love to hear your opinion. Remember, sometimes the past isn't just a memory, it's a warning. See you in the next chilling tale.